Have you ever wondered why someone who once seemed so distant suddenly begins to feel your absence long after you're gone? It's one of the quiet paradoxes of human psychology. When you loved someone who carried an avoidant attachment pattern, there may have been moments when you felt invisible, moments when your presence seemed to make little difference. You might have felt like you were the only one fighting for closeness, the only one trying to keep the emotional connection alive. And when things finally ended, it might have looked as if they walked away without a second thought, as if nothing had really changed for them. But what most people don't realize is that the emotional processing for someone with avoidant tendencies often happens very differently. For them, realization rarely arrives in the heat of the moment. It arrives later, slowly, quietly, when the noise of the relationship fades and the silence begins to echo. And in that silence, something starts to shift inside them. Because the truth is, once you're no longer there, things are not the same anymore. Your presence once filled spaces they didn't even realize existed. The conversations, the energy, the emotional grounding you provided, these things were quietly woven into their everyday life. When those threads disappear, the structure of their world subtly changes. At first, they might not notice it clearly. In fact, many avoidant individuals initially feel relief when distance appears. To them, closeness can sometimes feel overwhelming, even if they care deeply. But relief doesn't last forever, because eventually the mind begins to replay what it once pushed away. And that's when something unexpected begins to happen. The absence of someone who truly cared begins to reveal its weight. The silence begins to feel different. The space you once occupied becomes impossible to ignore. This isn't always visible from the outside. In fact, it's often completely hidden. Avoidant individuals are masters at appearing unaffected. They've spent years building emotional walls that protect them from vulnerability. But walls don't erase feelings, they only delay them. And when those delayed emotions finally surface, they often arrive in quiet moments of reflection, when there is no longer a relationship distracting them from what they truly felt. That's when the realization begins to form that things are not the same without you. To understand why this happens, you have to understand how avoidant attachment shapes the way someone experiences love. For many avoidant individuals, closeness has always been complicated. Deep down, they may crave connection just like anyone else, but at the same time, intimacy can trigger a sense of pressure or emotional vulnerability that feels uncomfortable. Because of this, they learn to create distance even from people they genuinely care about. Sometimes that distance appears as silence. Sometimes it appears as emotional detachment. Sometimes it appears as pulling away right when the relationship starts becoming deeper. From the outside, this behavior can make it seem like they don't value the relationship, but internally it's often more complex than that. Avoidant individuals are skilled at suppressing emotions in the moment. Instead of processing feelings as they arise, they push them aside so they can maintain their sense of independence. This coping mechanism allows them to stay calm and controlled during emotionally intense situations. But it also means something important. The emotional weight of a relationship doesn't fully register while the relationship is still happening. In other words, they often take the presence of someone who loves them for granted, not because they are intentionally careless, but because their mind has learned to minimize emotional dependence. When someone consistently shows up for them, supports them, and stays loyal despite their distance, it becomes part of the background of their life. It becomes something familiar, something assumed, something they believe will always be there. And when something feels permanent, the human mind rarely stops to examine its true value. It simply accepts it as normal. This is why many avoidant individuals only begin to understand the depth of a connection after it's gone. Once the relationship ends and that steady presence disappears, their mind no longer has the comfort of assuming it will return, and suddenly, what once felt ordinary begins to feel irreplaceable. One of the most powerful shifts happens when your presence is replaced by silence. During the relationship, communication, even imperfect communication, creates a rhythm between two people. Messages, shared moments, small conversations, even disagreements. All of these interactions create a sense of emotional movement. They remind both people that someone else exists in their world. When that rhythm stops, the difference becomes noticeable. At first, the silence may feel peaceful to someone with avoidant tendencies. The absence of emotional pressure can feel like breathing room. They may focus on work, hobbies, distractions, or new routines, but silence has a way of amplifying thoughts. Without the constant interaction of a relationship, the mind begins to wander back to what once filled that space. The messages that no longer arrive, the person who used to check in, the voice that used to share small details of the day. These things might have seemed insignificant while they were happening, but once they disappear, they begin to stand out in memory. The silence becomes a mirror. It reflects what used to be there, and slowly the avoidant mind begins to notice that something about their daily life feels different. The energy has shifted. The emotional landscape has changed. The quiet is heavier than they expected, because what they lost wasn't just a person, it was a presence that quietly shaped their emotional environment. What makes this experience even more confusing for avoidant individuals is the emotional gap that appears after the relationship ends. Many people expect breakups to immediately trigger sadness or longing, but for someone with avoidant attachment, the emotional timeline often works in reverse. At first, they might feel surprisingly calm, even relieved. The tension of intimacy has disappeared, and with it the pressure to respond emotionally. They may convince themselves that ending the connection was the right decision, that everything is simpler now, but emotional suppression has a cost. Feelings that are pushed away don't disappear permanently. They wait beneath the surface. And as time passes, something subtle begins to change. The calmness fades. The mind becomes more reflective. Memories start resurfacing in unexpected ways. A familiar place, a certain song, a quiet evening alone, these moments can suddenly trigger thoughts about the relationship they thought they had already moved on from. This is the emotional gap, the period when realization begins to catch up with them. During the relationship, they may have minimized the importance of what you brought into their life. But after the distance becomes real, they begin to see things from a different perspective. They start noticing the emotional support that once surrounded them, the patience you showed, the effort you made to understand them. These details become clearer when they're no longer present, and slowly a realization begins forming that they didn't fully appreciate the connection while they had it. Eventually, memories begin to surface in a deeper way, not just random flashes of the past, but detailed recollections of moments they once dismissed. The mind has a strange way of replaying emotional experiences when there is finally space to process them. Conversations they once brushed off begin to feel more meaningful. Small acts of kindness that seemed ordinary begin to stand out. They remember the way you tried to communicate even when they pulled away. The way you stayed patient when things became confusing. The way your presence created a sense of emotional warmth that quietly existed around them. When these memories appear, they often bring a mixture of emotions. Part of them may still want to maintain their independence and emotional distance, but another part begins to recognize something they didn't fully understand before, that the connection they experienced with you was rare, and that rarity becomes more visible with time, because once someone who genuinely cared is no longer present, the emotional contrast becomes clearer. New people may enter their life, new conversations may happen, new experiences may come and go, but the memory of the unique emotional energy you brought remains somewhere in their awareness, and that awareness can slowly transform the way they view the past. They may never say it out loud, they may never openly admit it, but deep inside, a quiet truth begins to take shape. Life continues. Routines continue, distractions continue, yet something about their world feels different now. Something that once existed is no longer there, and whether they acknowledge it or not, the realization grows stronger with time that things truly are not the same without you. As those memories continue to surface, something else slowly begins to emerge in their awareness. It's the realization that the energy you brought into their life was different from what they usually experience with other people. During the relationship, they may not have been able to fully recognize it. When someone has avoidant attachment patterns, emotional closeness can feel overwhelming, and their mind instinctively focuses on maintaining distance rather than appreciating connection. But once the relationship ends and time creates space for reflection, the emotional imprint you left behind begins to stand out in ways they didn't expect. They begin to remember how you tried to understand them even when they struggled to explain themselves. They remember how you offered emotional safety without demanding perfection. Your presence wasn't just another interaction in their life. It was something deeper, something stabilizing. You may have been the person who listened when they were silent, who showed patience when they withdrew, who remained steady when their emotions felt complicated, and that kind of emotional presence is rare. Many people come and go in someone's life, but very few leave behind a sense of calm understanding. That's the kind of energy that quietly stays with someone long after the relationship ends. For an avoidant individual, recognizing this difference can be both comforting and unsettling at the same time. Comforting because the memory reminds them that someone truly cared, but unsettling because it forces them to face something they may not have been ready to acknowledge before, that the connection they experienced with you was not ordinary. It had depth, patience, and emotional resilience. And when they start to notice that most people don't interact with them in the same way you did, the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. That's when the understanding begins to settle in more deeply. The realization that your presence carried a kind of emotional energy that can't easily be replaced. But even as this realization begins to form, an internal conflict often starts growing inside them. This is one of the most defining psychological struggles for someone with avoidant attachment. On one side of their mind is the part that values independence above everything else. This part of them has spent years learning to rely only on themselves, believing that emotional closeness creates vulnerability. It tells them that distance is safer, that relationships complicate life, that staying detached protects them from emotional pain. But on the other side of their mind is something they cannot fully silence, the part that remembers how it felt to have someone truly present in their life. That memory doesn't disappear easily. It lingers quietly in their thoughts, especially during moments when life feels lonely or emotionally empty. And that's where the conflict begins. One part of them insists they are better off alone, maintaining control over their emotions and avoiding the risks of deep attachment. But another part starts questioning that belief. Because if independence truly brought them everything they needed, then why do the memories of you keep appearing in their mind? Why does the silence sometimes feel heavier than expected? Why do certain moments remind them of what it felt like when someone genuinely cared? This internal struggle is rarely visible to the outside world. Avoidant individuals are often skilled at hiding their emotional conflicts. They continue with their routines, their responsibilities, their outward image of self-sufficiency. But internally, the contrast between independence and connection becomes more noticeable over time. And the more they reflect on the relationship they had with you, the more they begin to realize that their emotional walls may have protected them, but they also kept them from fully experiencing something meaningful. As time passes, another subtle shift often begins to happen. When new people enter their life, whether through friendships, casual interactions, or even new romantic connections, something unexpected occurs. They start comparing those interactions to the connection they once had with you, not always consciously, and not always in a way they openly admit. But the comparison still happens quietly in their mind. They notice the differences in emotional depth, the way conversations feel lighter, less meaningful, the way certain interactions feel more surface level compared to the understanding they experienced with you. When someone new tries to get close to them, they might find themselves remembering how you used to respond to their moods, how you recognized subtle emotional signals that others overlooked. The patience you showed begins to stand out more clearly when they encounter people who don't offer the same level of empathy, and this comparison creates a strange emotional personal experience, because while they once believed that distancing themselves from the relationship would make life simpler, they begin to notice that the connection they lost had qualities that are difficult to replicate. It wasn't just about companionship, it was about emotional familiarity. You knew parts of them that most people never saw. You stayed even when things became confusing, and that kind of emotional endurance is something many people struggle to offer. This realization doesn't always lead them to reach out or reconnect. Avoidant individuals often continue protecting their emotional independence even when they feel the weight of these comparisons, but internally the understanding becomes clearer. The connection they had with you carried a depth that can't easily be recreated with someone else. Eventually, the experience of loneliness begins to reveal itself in ways they didn't expect. For someone with avoidant tendencies, loneliness doesn't always appear in obvious ways. They may still be surrounded by people, activities, responsibilities, and daily distractions. On the surface, life continues as usual, but emotional loneliness is different from physical isolation. It's the quiet feeling that something meaningful is missing, even when life appears full. During the relationship, they may have felt overwhelmed by emotional closeness. But once that closeness disappears, they begin to notice the absence of the comfort it quietly provided, the feeling of knowing someone cared about their well-being, the sense that someone was emotionally invested in their life, the subtle reassurance that they were not navigating everything alone. When those emotional anchors disappear, the emptiness can become noticeable during quiet moments, late at night when the world becomes still, during achievements when there's no one who truly understands the journey behind them, during difficult days when there's no familiar presence offering support. These moments can create a kind of emotional loneliness that surprises them, because for a long time they believed they preferred distance. They believed independence meant not needing anyone deeply. But the human need for connection doesn't disappear simply because someone learned to suppress it. And as time passes, they may begin to recognize that while independence gave them control, it also removed the warmth that genuine emotional connection once brought into their life. Even with all of these realizations quietly forming inside them, one thing often remains the same: they rarely admit that they miss you. For someone with avoidant attachment, acknowledging emotional longing can feel extremely uncomfortable. It requires vulnerability, honesty, and the willingness to confront feelings they spent years learning to suppress. Admitting that someone mattered deeply can make them feel exposed, as if they are losing the emotional control they worked so hard to maintain. Because of this, they often keep these feelings hidden. Instead of expressing them openly, they process them privately. They may reflect on the past silently. They may revisit memories without ever sharing those thoughts with anyone. To the outside world, it may appear as if they have completely moved on, but internally the story is often more complicated. Missing someone doesn't always look the same for everyone. For avoidant individuals, it may appear as quiet reflection rather than outward emotion. It may show up as curiosity about how your life is going, even if they never ask directly. It may appear in subtle moments when they remember something you once said, or when they notice how different their life feels without your presence. These feelings exist beneath the surface, often unspoken but still real, and this is one of the most misunderstood aspects of avoidant psychology. Just because someone doesn't openly express their emotions doesn't mean those emotions don't exist. Sometimes the people who appear the most emotionally distant are simply the ones who learned to hide their feelings the deepest. And as time moves forward, those hidden emotions can slowly reshape the way they understand the connection they once had with you. Over time, the feelings they try so carefully to keep hidden begin to reveal themselves in subtle ways. Avoidant individuals rarely express their emotions directly, but their behavior can sometimes tell a quieter story. Even when they convince themselves that they have moved on, curiosity about you can slowly return. It might start with a passing thought about how you're doing, a small question appearing in their mind when something reminds them of the past. They may wonder if your life has changed, if you are happier now, if someone else has stepped into the space they once occupied. Sometimes that curiosity becomes stronger than they expected. They might look for signs of your life from a distance, not necessarily because they plan to reconnect, but because part of them wants reassurance that the bond they once shared truly mattered. The mind has a strange way of revisiting unfinished emotional stories. When a connection ends without full understanding, the brain continues searching for meaning. For avoidant individuals, this process can be slow and quiet. They may check old messages they once ignored. They may revisit memories they pushed aside during the relationship. They may even find themselves wondering what would happen if they reached out, even though they rarely act on that impulse. None of these behaviors are dramatic. They are subtle, almost invisible to the outside world. But internally they reflect something important, the realization that the emotional presence you once brought into their life hasn't completely faded from their mind. Even after distance, even after time, something about that connection continues to exist in their thoughts. As this internal reflection continues, something deeper begins to happen. The emotional walls they built over the years start to develop small cracks. These walls were never created overnight. They were formed through experiences that taught them to protect their independence at all costs. Emotional closeness may have once felt risky, unpredictable, or overwhelming, so they learned to guard themselves by staying detached. During the relationship, those walls may have appeared solid and unbreakable. When conversations became too emotional, they withdrew. When vulnerability appeared, they shifted their focus to something else. But distance has a way of weakening emotional defenses. When someone who truly cared is no longer present, the mind loses the ability to dismiss the relationship so easily. The absence forces reflection, and reflection slowly chips away at the certainty those walls once provided. They begin questioning moments they previously ignored. They start recognizing how often you tried to bridge the emotional distance between you. They may even realize that some of their reactions were driven by fear rather than indifference. This doesn't mean they suddenly become emotionally open. Avoidant attachment patterns don't disappear overnight, but the awareness begins to grow. The walls that once seemed permanent start feeling less certain, and inside that uncertainty, a quiet truth begins forming, the realization that protecting themselves from vulnerability may have also cost them a connection that genuinely mattered. With that awareness often comes a feeling that many avoidant individuals struggle to face: regret. But this regret rarely looks the way people expect. It isn't always expressed through apologies or emotional confessions. Instead, it often lives quietly within their thoughts. They replay certain moments from the relationship with a different perspective than they had before. Conversations they once dismissed begin to sound different in their memory. They remember times when you asked for closeness, and they responded with distance. Times when you tried to communicate your feelings, and they chose silence instead. During the relationship, those reactions may have felt natural to them. Their instinct was always to maintain emotional space, but when they look back later, especially after time has softened their defenses, they may begin to see those moments in a new light. They realize that someone was genuinely trying to connect with them. Someone was offering patience and emotional understanding that they didn't fully acknowledge at the time. This realization can create a quiet sense of regret, not necessarily regret for the relationship ending, but regret for not fully recognizing the effort that was being given to them, regret for not allowing themselves to experience the connection more openly. For many avoidant individuals, this reflection happens long after the relationship is over, and because expressing vulnerability still feels uncomfortable, they often carry these thoughts privately. But that doesn't make the feelings any less real. Sometimes the deepest regrets are the ones that remain unspoken. One of the most powerful psychological effects of distance is the way it forces emotional awareness to grow. When two people are constantly interacting, emotions can become blurred by routine, misunderstandings, and everyday distractions. It becomes easy to overlook the deeper meaning of the connection, but when distance enters the picture, the mind finally has space to examine what truly existed. For someone with avoidant attachment, this space can be transformative. Without the pressure of the relationship, they begin observing their emotions from a safer distance. The fear of vulnerability becomes less immediate, which allows them to reflect more honestly. They may start realizing that the closeness they once resisted wasn't actually a threat. It was an opportunity for connection that they didn't fully understand at the time. The absence of that connection creates a contrast that highlights its importance. Moments of kindness you showed begin to appear more meaningful. The emotional support you offered becomes clearer in hindsight. Even the difficult conversations start making more sense when viewed through the lens of reflection. Distance has a way of revealing truths that were hidden during the chaos of the relationship. It allows emotions that were once suppressed to finally reach the surface. And through this process, many avoidant individuals begin to understand something that once seemed invisible to them, that emotional closeness wasn't the enemy they believed it was. Eventually, this reflection can lead to one of the most profound realizations of all. They begin to understand that the connection they experienced with you was rare. In the beginning, they may have believed that relationships are easily replaceable, that if one connection ends, another will appear without much difference. But as time moves forward and life introduces new people and new experiences, they start noticing something unexpected. Not every connection carries the same emotional depth. Not every person offers the same patience, understanding, or consistency that you once did. Genuine emotional presence is difficult to find. It requires someone who is willing to stay through confusion, someone who is willing to communicate through distance, someone who believes in the connection even when things become complicated. When avoidant individuals reflect on the past and recognize that they once had someone like that in their life, the realization can be powerful. It doesn't necessarily mean they will try to return or change the past, but internally their perception of the relationship begins to shift. What once felt ordinary now appears unique. What once felt overwhelming now appears meaningful. And this is often the moment when the full weight of your absence becomes clear to them. Because once someone recognizes that a rare connection has been lost, they also understand something else, that some people leave a lasting imprint on our lives, even when the relationship itself is no longer there, and that imprint can quietly stay with them for far longer than they ever expected. Once that realization settles in, that the connection they experienced was rare, another emotion often begins to appear beneath the surface. It's not just reflection anymore, it's fear. Not the kind of fear that makes someone run away from danger, but a quieter, more complicated fear that keeps them from reaching out, even when part of them wants to. For someone with avoidant attachment patterns, the idea of reconnecting can feel emotionally overwhelming, because reaching out would mean facing something they have spent years trying to avoid. Vulnerability. It would mean admitting that the connection mattered more than they allowed themselves to believe. It would mean confronting the possibility that they may have hurt someone who once cared deeply about them. And perhaps the most frightening part of all is the uncertainty of how you would respond. What if you've already moved on? What if you no longer see them the same way? What if the door they once walked away from is no longer open? These questions can create a kind of emotional paralysis, even if they feel the absence of your presence in their life, even if they understand that the bond you shared was meaningful. The fear of facing those emotions directly can hold them back. Instead of acting on the impulse to reconnect, they often remain silent. They convince themselves that distance is still the safer choice. But silence doesn't erase the awareness they've gained. The memories still exist. The understanding that something valuable was lost still remains in their mind, and this creates a quiet tension inside them. Part of them wonders what might happen if they reached out. Another part insists that staying silent protects them from emotional exposure. This internal struggle can last for a long time, because for someone who built their identity around emotional independence, admitting that they miss someone or that they wish things had unfolded differently can feel like stepping into unfamiliar territory. Yet sometimes the experience of losing a meaningful connection can become the very thing that begins to change them. Not immediately, and not in a dramatic way, but gradually over time. When someone repeatedly reflects on a relationship that once held depth and emotional sincerity, it can spark a process of self-awareness they didn't expect. They start asking questions they never asked before. Why did closeness make them uncomfortable? Why did they withdraw when someone tried to understand them? Why did they create distance even when the connection itself was genuine? These questions don't always have simple answers. Often they lead back to long-standing emotional patterns that developed years earlier. Patterns that taught them to rely only on themselves. Patterns that made vulnerability feel unsafe. But recognizing these patterns is the first step towards something important: growth. Some avoidant individuals begin slowly examining their behavior in past relationships. They may notice that the same emotional cycle repeated itself more than once. Someone gets close, they start feeling overwhelmed, they withdraw, the relationship fades, and only later do they reflect on what might have been different if they had allowed themselves to stay emotionally present. This awareness can become a turning point, not because it magically transforms them overnight, but because it opens the possibility of change. They begin realizing that emotional closeness doesn't always lead to loss of independence. That vulnerability, when shared with the right person, can actually strengthen a connection instead of weakening it. And sometimes the memory of someone who once cared deeply about them becomes a quiet motivation to grow. The realization that they may have pushed away something meaningful can inspire them to approach future relationships with more openness than before. Of course, one of the most common questions people ask when they've loved someone with avoidant attachment is whether that person ever comes back. It's a question filled with hope, curiosity, and sometimes lingering pain. The answer, however, is rarely simple. Avoidant individuals do sometimes return to connections they once walked away from, but it doesn't always happen in the way people expect. When they do reach out again, it's often after a long period of reflection, a time when the emotional distance has allowed them to process feelings they previously suppressed. During this period, the absence of the relationship may have revealed its importance in ways they didn't fully understand before. But it's also important to recognize something else. Not every avoidant individual returns, even when they acknowledge that the connection mattered. Their fear of vulnerability can still hold them back from acting on that realization. They may choose to carry the memory quietly, rather than risk reopening the emotional story. This is why focusing only on whether someone comes back can sometimes keep you trapped in uncertainty, because their decision depends on factors you cannot control. Their willingness to confront their fears, their readiness to change old patterns, and their capacity for emotional honesty. What truly matters more than their return is the understanding you gain from the experience itself, because the connection you shared, the patience you offered, and the emotional sincerity you brought into the relationship were real. Those qualities reflect something important about you, not just about them. Whether they return or not, the love and understanding you gave were not wasted. They were part of a genuine human connection that shaped both of your lives in ways that may continue long after the relationship ended. While the avoidant individual may be going through their own internal journey, something equally powerful is happening in your life as well. The experience of loving someone who struggled with emotional closeness often pushes people toward personal growth they never expected. In the beginning, you may have focused entirely on trying to understand them, why they withdrew, why they struggled to express their feelings, why the relationship felt so confusing at times. But as time passes, your attention slowly shifts inward. You begin reflecting on your own emotional needs, on the importance of being valued, respected, and emotionally met within a relationship. This growth changes something fundamental in the dynamic between you and the person who once pulled away. When someone begins healing, developing self-respect, and recognizing their own worth, the energy they carry into the world transforms. You become less focused on chasing emotional validation from someone who struggles to give it. Instead, you begin building a life that reflects your own sense of stability and fulfillment. And ironically, this is often the moment when the dynamic between you and the avoidant individual shifts the most. Because when someone who once sought closeness begins standing confidently in their own independence, the emotional balance changes. The person who once withdrew may begin noticing that you are no longer waiting for their attention or approval. Your life has moved forward. Your emotional strength has grown, and that growth can sometimes awaken a deeper recognition within them. They see that the person they once took for granted has become even stronger, even more self-aware, even more emotionally grounded. And in that moment, the true value of the connection they once had with you may become clearer than ever before. In the end, the most powerful lesson behind this entire experience isn't simply about whether someone realizes your value after you're gone. It's about understanding the deeper meaning of connection itself. Loving someone with avoidant attachment can be one of the most emotionally complex experiences a person goes through. It can leave you questioning your worth, wondering if your presence ever truly mattered. But the truth is that genuine emotional presence always leaves an imprint. The patience you showed, the understanding you offered, the way you tried to build a connection even when it felt difficult, these things are never as invisible as they might have seemed in the moment. Even if someone struggled to recognize it while the relationship was happening, the emotional energy you brought into their life still existed. And sometimes it's only after distance and reflection that its value becomes fully understood. But perhaps the most important realization is this: your worth was never dependent on their ability to express love in the way you needed. Your capacity to care deeply, to show empathy, to believe in meaningful connection, these are strengths, not weaknesses. They reflect the kind of emotional depth that creates real relationships, the kind that leave lasting impressions on the people we meet throughout our lives. Some people will recognize that value immediately, others may take time to understand it, and a few may only realize it long after the moment has passed. But regardless of how someone else processes the connection, the truth remains the same. The love you gave was real, the presence you brought into that relationship was meaningful, and the experience itself, with all of its challenges and growth, became part of the story that shaped both of your lives. Because when someone truly shows up with sincerity and emotional depth, their absence doesn't simply disappear from memory. It leaves a quiet reminder that some connections, even when they end, continue to echo in ways that change people forever.